Hey folks, Steve here with another Case Yellow 1940 video for you today. This is going to be our campaign post-mortem video. If you're not familiar with my video coverage series methodology here, my post-mortem video I usually will do after the completion of a campaign prior to a review or additional campaign plays to just kind of give a lessons learned chat or stream of thought conversation around what we observed during the campaign playthrough and some strategic considerations. What were some bad moves that I made in retrospect, which were really key events during the campaign. And the intent here is not to review the game. It is not to look at necessarily some aspect of the game that I really dislike or liked, but how the mechanics all really played out, of course, across the narrative of the playthrough. So do not look at this as a review. This is just my thoughts on how the campaign that I played went and what were some really important aspects as I learned to play the game during these 10 turns. And really, we're going to count the first try, those first few turns where we gave it a shot, because I think there were some important things learned there along the way. Um, so if this video interests you, then stick around. If this doesn't seem valuable, you can wait around for the review, or maybe I'm going to play another campaign, maybe in a different video format, though. We'll talk about that later in the video, I guess. But to give you the too long didn't watch version of it, I am interested in possibly playing Scenario 3. But if I do play Scenario 3 and record it, it will be in a very truncated style, where basically it will be one longer video where I basically cover the events of each turn for 10 turns. So probably about an hour or more's worth of video content there. Not doing it every action round like this series has been up to this point. It would just be, basically that way it'll be much faster. I can get it done in a couple of days, a Scenario 3 playthrough, and get the video put together and put up rather than the weeks it's taken to do this series. Anyway, we'll examine some of the nuances as to why Scenario 3 might be interesting and why it will be more interesting than Scenario 2 later in this video as a part of the postmortem. So let's first cover a couple of things that were big transitions between attempt number 1 and attempt number 2, the one that ended up finishing. I think generally the attempt number 1 was kind of a false start for a couple of reasons. One, I was getting some of the river rules wrong, and that was what caused the restart. The other thing is I didn't appreciate how much of a puzzle the Netherlands ultimately are. So, and I'll adjust the camera here a second so that we can focus in on the Netherlands. And the fact that the game comes with, on the back of one of the player aid sheets, a map where you can just set up, the Netherlands and play on this smaller map and sort of game that out by itself, is probably a good indicator. I should have thought about doing that myself off camera to get familiar with the game. Because in that first attempt, I did not efficiently take out the Netherlands. We still did it on turn, I think it was turn 2. But when I did attempt number 2, campaign number 2, it was clear that you could figure out the right way to consistently take the Netherlands out on turn 1. Die rolls could screw you. You could still end up in a case where it's going to have to be turn 2 if the dice just went really bad your way. But I had kind of figured out that consistent method, or at least I could probably repeat it. How do you take out the Netherlands on turn 1? So that was important. And I think in any game of this, if you're playing Case Yellow Opposed or Solitaire, whatever, like, it almost becomes for the Germans, assuming you're playing Scenario 1 at least, like, taking the Netherlands out on turn 1 is kind of a must-do. You really need to try to do that. If it goes to turn 2, okay, but it's really going to help the life of the game if you take out the Netherlands on turn 1, because those victory points you get for doing it on turn 1 are really important. The Germans don't have a lot of places to get victory points, and that's really the whole balance of Scenario 1, the scenario that we played I played and you watched, but for attempt number 1 and number 2, right? The victory conditions of the Germans must have more than twice as many victory points as the Allies. Means that every victory point that the Germans get is effectively half as good as the victory points that the Allies get. And when you're really talking about a finite number of ways to get victory points, every single one counts a lot. And even that handful you get for taking out the Netherlands on turn 1 is super important. Now, Belgium's a kind of a different story because even if you really crack the Belgians around here, you would either have to eliminate every single unit of theirs to force them to surrender, or you get all the way out to Ostend out here. And you've taken all the other Belgian cities of importance. That is certainly doable in a timeline that will get you some victory points as the Germans. I don't think you're ever going to take them out on turn 2, not unless the Allies have done something really silly and they've just put too many Belgian units out front. Because you can very easily have the setup and do movement and have the Allies put a Belgian unit like somewhere back here, and by the time the Germans even get there, you've probably been able to spirit that guy away one way or another. So you can certainly delay the Belgians to some degree. There are some movement restrictions for the Belgians, but generally speaking, I would not, you're not going to see it that early, but it's certainly doable as the Germans. You definitely want to do that. When we look at the rest of the campaign after, turns 1 and 2, right? You could very obviously make the statement that if you're not across the Meuse by turn 3, the game's screwed, right? Fortunately, a lot of the special rules of Scenario 1 really kind of make it so that, yes, the Germans can likely consistently take out the Netherlands. They can certainly hurt the Belgians, and they should be able to get to get to the Meuse or be able to cross the Meuse within those first few turns. So all these must-dos there are going to be able to be done. You're very unlikely to run into situations where you can't do those things. It's once you get across the Meuse that I think the game really starts for Scenario 1, because once you're across the Meuse and the Allies are preparing to declare Operation Dynamo, I think is the first real flashpoint or critical point in the game that will determine victory. Because I think in the first game, right, like if we just say that my river mistakes evened out in the end, I think if we had kept playing game 1, the Allies would have won. And I say that because they were really able to get, or they were in a good place to have evacuated a huge number of units. The Allies would have likely have declared Paris an open city, and the total sum of victory points that the Germans could get would not have been enough to give them twice as many victory points. Now that's a projection. I can't right now, because I had already moved all the units and I set up to play again. I mean, I'd have to really have gone through and figured out what was conceivable. But if I were to bet, I would bet that the Allies would have won, even if we had played the rivers correctly from then on out and everything else. I think it's more likely that the Allies would have simply won that game. Now, of course, when we did game 2, I managed for the Germans to incorporate all of this hindsight, and we ended up with a very lopsided German victory because we managed to get this huge encirclement, and the Allies got very little off the continent via Dunkirk. Very little. I mean, a handful of units. It's still, even with that being the case, it still applied some pressure to the Germans to make sure that they could achieve other victory conditions, right? Now, they ended up doing so pretty handily, but I can definitely see where if you're playing this game opposed and you've all decided to play Scenario 1, for better or for worse, turns 3, 4, and 5 are probably the most important turns of the game, because everything is going to be based around how many units got out of Dunkirk. If the Germans have not been able to shut down the port, and the Allies have gotten a huge amount of units out of the port, you're going to be able to call the game. If the Allies end up with 30 victory points, somebody figured this out on the forums on Board Game Geek or something, but like if the Allies get near 30 points or somewhere around 30 victory points, the Germans cannot, I don't think it's even possible for them to consistently achieve 61 victory points. It might not even be feasible for them to do it. And so when you look at that, you could really call the game, right? You could call the game early and say, well, the Allies just got too much stuff out. They got too many victory points from that perspective. Doesn't matter what the Germans do from here on out. Like the game is done. Like that's it. You're kaput. Um, and that's probably fair, right? Because you can just say, well, if all the events of the game follow the historical narrative, then that is a really a loss for the Germans in terms of this game design, because it's not about necessarily winning the campaign. It's, do you win the campaign in such a way that Germany is going to perform better in World War II because you performed this campaign that much better than history. If the game just goes to history's narrative, well, the Allies will remain a danger. Britain will hold out against Germany, will not sign a conditional peace, or armistice or peace fight, something. They're not going to capitulate, and they stick it out, and all the rest of World War II happens, or however you want to evaluate that, right? Um, Now here the Germans did extraordinarily well, and maybe they basically eliminated the British army. Maybe they're considering it, a sea lion. Maybe they are going to try a sea lion. However foolish that might be, the British have lost their army, and maybe that's enough to convince Parliament not to continue the war. Who knows, right? I mean, we're getting into kind of wacky territory here. So suffice to say, that's your real first decision point in scenario one. Does Operation Dynamo succeed very well? If it succeeds very well, then that's the game. If the Germans do what I did and manage to encircle the army and eliminate it, you can probably game it out a little bit longer, because there's still maybe some things that might matter a whole lot. Timing, right? If you can't reduce the pocket very fast, then that delays the German advance towards Paris. And you would do like what I did, which is figure out, okay, you don't declare Paris an open city, you try to hold the line, and if you can keep them out, that might be enough to keep the Germans from getting enough victory points to win. So you can probably still game it out from there if Operation Dynamo is a failure. What you're probably going to get is some difference between the extremes. You're not going to get everybody out of Dunkirk, and you're not going to have the entire British and French armies encircled. And so the game will probably stay interesting throughout, and maybe some nail biting affairs. On the board, the Allies are still losing the campaign, but in terms of the game victory and where those victory points are going to end up and how important every single victory point is for the Germans, I can still see it being contentious. I just happen to have extraordinary success as the Germans. And all of that came down to, ultimately, getting across the river here, but then having not enough Allied units right along the coast where they zipped across. And could kind of do so without worrying too much about supply, because all they really did was unhinge the Allied position. That's all it took. They could just, as long as they could get over here somehow, even being out of supply, or they would eventually be marked out of supply, they could continue to keep moving and threaten closing the port outright, and just causing a lot of problems there. And the best that I could tell, it seems like, and maybe there's some errata that clarifies this, it seems like if the Germans capture the Dynamo port, like that's it's done. You don't get it back if you take it back, but I'm not 100% sure of that. And maybe I'd allow the Allies to take it back and to continue to evacuate units out of there, but it wasn't relevant for our game because they really stopped having a chance eventually. But it was important because we had these guys coming on the north, and our sufficient breakthrough was coming up this way, and we were cutting supply off over here into these other ports. So there was just really like this constraint over what the Allies could do that really contributed. So I mean, if given scenarios one's constraints, where the Allies have to be up here on the dial plan line, they can't get in front of things in the Ardennes, I think the game is at least balanced enough in terms of what you can do and what your carrots and sticks are to attempt a strategy. What do the Allies need to do? What do the Germans need to do? It is still a game worth playing, though obviously the Allied player just has to take into account that this is a defense positioning game in scenario one. Their counterattacks will be limited. I mean, in this game, we hardly removed any German units at all the whole game. They just couldn't counterattack. They couldn't counterattack in force. Once the encirclement occurred, there was almost no point. And you wanted to kind of keep some units alive so you could evacuate them. But if you can't evacuate them, then it's all tail up. The Maginot Line stuff, we were making some attacks. We were eventually getting enough force over here. I think my problem was if you really want to focus on the Maginot Line, you got to pick where you're going to go. You eventually have to wait for the French to be pulling units off to defend Paris. And even then, you need to keep an attack supply unit over here or you're going to lose a shift. And then you've got to position your artillery in such a way that this artillery unit will be of use somewhere. And because you can only take a Maginot Line hex if you get a DE result. And the DE result requires you to at least have 3-to-1 odds after all is said and done. And really, you want to have even more than that. I mean, per history, like you're not going to get like a ton of these Maginot breakthroughs, right? It's not going to happen a whole lot until the line is thinned out due to repositioning. But it kind of felt like I had this urge that I should be trying to do that because you can get more victory points. If I had not done this encirclement, if the Allied had gotten more guys off the continent, I probably would have felt a greater drive to try a lot harder to get into a Maginot Line breakthrough condition, but it just never really manifested. And again, I question how the victory points work on 3 contiguous Maginot Line hexes and how you calculate that over the life of the game. But you're probably, unless you're extraordinarily lucky, you're probably not going to have many situations where many of these hexes will become taken by the Germans. Just unlikely to happen because you are really focused on everything over here, and the concentration of strength points has to be over here ultimately. The Allied interdiction stuff ended up becoming almost useless early in the game. Like as soon as the Germans had, for any given river crossing, like if they had a redundant crossing, the Allies didn't even bother. There was no point. And there's a couple of places where like that matters more. Like over here, there's one local crossing. Otherwise, you have to be down here or you have to be over here at Namur. So here, but like for the Germans, what it's really more important is that like don't cross this river until you figure you can cross the river somewhere else. And they could more or less consistently do that. They didn't really have that much a problem doing that. So most of the time, if you're the Allies and you have 1 or 2 air units, you're not going to risk them doing doing the river interdiction, the crossing interdiction. Only in very select circumstances is it even worthwhile to try. And while it can be valuable, putting units out of supply is really just a shift. Like that's it. Like you knock them down a shift, but everything else, they're still potent. I mean, they might only be able to move a couple hexes, but they can still do a lot of damage. And so it just never felt very compelling to do it after the first couple of turns when the actual river constraints are there in greater force. But for the Germans, it's all about redundancy. Get redundancy over the rivers so you can trace supply, so you have a line of communication, all of that. And by comparison, the Stukas were very valuable. You could do a lot. There's a lot of flexibility. You could do the disruption, to clear the line for the armor units. I use them mostly for shifts because it just gave us great shifts on the combat chart to where we could pretty reasonably say we were going to eliminate a 1-step unit or we were going to at least heavily hurt core units. So for sure that advantage is just very helpful for the Germans. No doubt about it. They the Allied air markers are almost there to just try to slow down and offset the German air, and that is really what I think that's all they're good for, honestly, and it's probably by design that all matches expectation. The attack supply stuff with these units ended up, I mean, you definitely want them where you think you're going to make progress. And their movement is enough that you can reposition them pretty well, even if they only move once a turn. Um, the fact that ultimately the Allies were going to be constantly out of attack supply most of the time because they only have the one attack supply unit. Otherwise, they need a trace from Paris or whatever. That is another thing that contributed to the Allies just never counterattack. I mean, they just can't get the shifts to get anywhere near good enough to make the die roll worth it. Um, it just didn't make sense because if you attrit yourself, maybe you get lucky and you take some Panzer units out. It would have been nice to do that. I never felt like we had a good opportunity to do that. If you get BL1s, okay, that's useful, but you're attriting away your ability to defend, and it'll be that much easier for the Germans to concentrate attack power and eliminate you when you're on the defensive. So again, all that relates back to, at least in scenario one, the Allies are just doing the move and shift. Shift your defense, figure out how you're going to get those victory points. And I think the Allies are certainly going to try. It's just in this game they got really hobbled in their ability. In attempt number two, hobbled their ability to get those points, and it was really just all about what could the Germans do, how quickly. And obviously, the Germans did very well there. So, it's harder to give a real post-mortem assessment. I mean, I've already talked a lot, but it's hard to give much more of an assessment here because so much of scenario one is a railroad of sorts where, yeah, you have to set up a certain way. Yeah, you have to operate a certain way in the first couple of turns. And even by the time the game kind of opens up for decision making, the situation is what it is. You just have to figure out how do I adapt my strategy to how Operation Dynamo went. I think that's where it boils down to. Did Operation Dynamo go well? Then maybe you win the game as the Allies. If it only does okay, then you need to figure out, am I going to have Paris as an open city or not? Can I do anything else to set up a better defense? How many units did I pull out of here down to the south to reinforce the defense? And you do kind of have to plan ahead for that, I guess, right? If you try to earmark, here are the units I'm going to try to get out of the port, here are the units I'm going to shift to the southwest to defend Paris. I think the earlier you do that as the Allies, you have a pretty good idea of where and how you're going to move these units, the better off you'll be. Because the Germans could be, streaking out this way, and maybe you can move some French units back, behind them, but to get in front of Paris or get to Amiens or some of these river lines. If you just figure like I'm not going to bother to defend with those guys, I want to defend Paris rather than Dunkirk or whatever. I think as the Allies, you have to make those decisions. So there are still important decisions that you're going to be making as the defensive player all throughout the game, even though you're on defense. And it feels more exciting as the Germans to be making the decisions of where to attack and how to achieve the objectives with your fast movers, your tanks, and everything else. Something else I want to hit in this video is how much of this game state changes when you play the other scenarios. And I'll say this, again, this is not the review, but I will take a shot at the game a little bit, that the playbook, and I mentioned this earlier, how, okay, there's the rule book and there's the playbook. And usually in a GMT game, the playbook has some scenario setup information, and that's usually it. And then there's some example of play and other good content in the playbook. I usually love the playbooks from GMT. Favorite part of the game, because there's a lot of fun stuff to flip through and look at, even if you're not going to play the game right then and there. The trick with this game is that each scenario has so much extra rules to consume. You have to flip back and forth between the rulebook and the playbook to make sure you're going to play the game correctly. And I have found now, by comparing the rules of scenario 1, 2, and 3 against each other in the playbook, they really could have gotten away with handling this differently. It would probably mean increasing the size of the rulebook slightly, but you would save a lot more paper and reducing the size of the playbook, and actually have fewer things that the player has to keep in mind when they're playing these different scenarios, because the bulk of everything is in the rulebook. Now, this is especially difficult from a PDF perspective because this playbook is not available as a PDF, at least not that I'm aware of, and I haven't scanned it myself and created my own PDF. So the fact that I have to keep referring specifically to the book and have to go back and forth between the rulebook and the playbook is very annoying. That will probably make it into the review in some fashion. When I compared Scenario 1 to Scenario 2, the differences between them are minute. So, and I'm not going to go through a page by page kind of thing, but here's Scenario 1. You see there's several pages. Many of these sections are basically the same in Scenario 2. Very, very, very similar. So to make sense of that, what I would like to see, if this game ever gets remade or republished, maybe they give it a Dark Series moniker when it gets reprinted, right? Or treat it as a brand new game, but it is on the skeleton of this game. That you move all this stuff into one section, because wherever everything is similar, put it in one section. Where it's different, you have a little heading that says Scenario 1 and 2, you have a section that says Scenario 3. So rather than having 3 paragraphs, you have 1 paragraph in 3 lines that just say, this is how the basic thing works, this is how the basic setup works, and for these scenarios, do this that's different. There is an easier way to organize this stuff, I think. But let's say we wanted to play Scenario 2, and what would be different and why it might be more interesting. So Scenario 2 is described as a better allied intelligence game. And so the main things that change, because not as much changes, much of it is the same as Scenario 1 in the broad strokes. The way they look at this is that, again, most things are almost exactly the same. The only thing that's really different, it kills me. This text about German garrisons is exactly the same. I'm pretty confident it is exactly the same as Scenario 1. They didn't need to reprint that. So a couple of things. The initial unit placement. These French units set up in different hexes than are on the counter. Now, this is a lot to look at. I'm just going to go ahead and summarize for you that basically each unit is several hexes further south than where they start, basically. That's more or less how it works out. And what that means from a setup perspective is, rather than having some of these units stuck up here, they're down just a little bit, which means they don't have as far to go to protect the Ardennes, if that's what you choose to do with them. So that's one big difference, right? That's what you get in Scenario 2 that gets away from the straitjacket stuff. Then for the movement restrictions, what changes is that the Allied star movement codes are not used in Scenario 2 and can be disregarded. All units are free to move from the first Allied move action onward through basically, wherever they want, except for the Maginot Zone. So by and large, the rules that govern the Maginot Line and its surrounding area is pretty much the same from Scenario 1. So things that are down in here, we'll say, right? There's a graphic in the book that shows this, right? Down there. Those guys still have some movement restrictions. So you can't peel everybody off the Maginot Line. But all the rules that govern these units, and just to show, an example of a couple of these, like you would have these Red Star units that had to move to the dial plan as much as possible, as far as they could go. They don't have to do that. And then you have these Black Star units that can't move at all for 2 movement actions. Well, you don't have to do that. So all of a sudden, the Allies can actually they can abandon the dial plan entirely and do something else. And I think that's a pretty strong buff to the Allied position. The other thing that can be done, and this is kind of annoying, Scenario 2 has 2 variants, Variant 1 and Variant 2. and it is such that their victory conditions are actually even a little bit different, which to me speaks to it, or speaks as like they really should have had this as separate scenarios somehow, but or some better way to communicate the information. In variant 1, the Allied player may reposition up to 10 French units outside of the Maginot Zone. So yeah, they do have to keep some down here like we mentioned, but they get to pick a certain number that they can move elsewhere. There's a couple of British units they can also reposition. And so you have this opportunity to set things up just a little bit differently, so that you can actually cover the Ardennes better. So what you end up having is you do have some units that are set up as required, but from the get-go, you can reinforce to wherever you want, near the dial plan line or further back or whatever. You have the opportunity to set up some units in a little bit more strategic positions, and you can better cover the Ardennes. This blind spot suddenly is not so much a blind spot anymore. Now, variant 1 has a stipulation that if you do this, right, or if you're doing variant 1 and you do this thing, the German player, after the Allied player sets up all his units, but can reposition up to 10 of theirs. So what this kind of does is, yes, the Allies have a little bit of leeway now to set up a better defense, for sure. But the Germans can also move 10 of their units. So basically, if you say, hey, I'm going to really protect the blind spot, but I'm going to effectively make Belgium under-defended, the German player has the option to take some of his, let's say all of his Panzer units, and put them up here instead and push through here. Almost like, I don't know, a Schlieffen-like plan, right, could occur, where they send them through here. And you could maybe have like a reverse situation where they swing down this way instead of swinging up this way, or whatever, right? Like something like that could occur. If the players set it up that way, or it just ends up being a very balanced situation, and maybe it's tougher for the Germans that way because they benefit from having a weak place to focus. If they don't have a weak place to focus, then they can't do that. And so then the victory conditions for variant 1 are the same, though. The German player has to have twice the number of Allied victory points with this. So I would say right out of the gate that scenario 2 version 1, variant 1, is probably much, much, much tougher for the Germans in terms of the game. They have to still meet the same victory threshold. They get victory points the same way as they do in scenario 1, but they don't get all of these historical advantages. So I would already say, just right out of the gate, I'm probably not that interested in playing scenario 2 variant 1. Even with the Germans' ability to, I don't know, it might be fun to play a post, I guess, but something about it just makes me think the Germans are going to have a really, really, really hard time, because so much of their success relies upon this ability to do this thing here, right? If the Allies don't have to do the dial plan, or aren't set up in the dial plan, and they don't have the blind spot, and the Germans are still expected to get double the victory points, it feels really hard to figure out how they would achieve that well. It's not to say they couldn't do it, but given how I have read that folks, have scenario 1 and the Germans can never win because the Allies just do reasonably well at Dynamo. I could see a similar challenge, right? They've got to pick somewhere, and maybe by defending the Ardennes, they weaken up here enough in the flat terrain that the Germans really can make something useful happen there. Anything's possible, but I would worry it's a little too difficult. I don't know. And if you're watching this and you've played scenario 2, let me know. Now let's compare this with variant 2. Scenario 2, variant 2. In variant 2, the Allied player gets to reposition their units, but the German player does not get to reposition their units. So it's kind of worse. The only saving grace is the Germans have an easier victory point threshold. Let's see if I can get this to focus. The German player wins if they get 20 at least 20 victory points. You guys can't read that. There we go. At least 20 victory points more than the allied player in the victory determination segment of turn 10. So you need at least 20 more. That's much, much better than twice, because at least that is a discrete number that you can shoot for, right? However many the allies get, you just need 20 more than that. I think the same thing applies. If the allies get close to 30 victory points, okay, 20 plus 30 is 50. Do the Germans have the ability to get 50 victory points? Keeping in mind that even in this great game that we played, where the Germans won by quite a bit, they really only won because we deprived the Allies of getting stuff out of Dynamo. Germans ended up with 38 victory points. Now, granted, some stuff, I didn't have to try as hard, and maybe I could have gotten more of these guys off map than I did. So let's say, we could probably bump that up closer to 40 or 42. I still think 50 is probably hard to get. So if the Allies still do well at Dynamo, then that's a problem. If the Allies do not have to defend the dial plan, they probably have a lot easier time setting up something of a defense that can hold out while they have a lot of these guys just ready to leave, ready to rock and roll, and even have an easier time figuring out which units will not evacuate and will defend. So very generally, I would say scenario 2 is probably more of a game, certainly. But I already feel like the Germans they're going to have a much harder time in victory, but it really would come down to the setup. So I don't know. The more I'm talking about it now, the less confident I am in my own opinion, because it really could be, you cover the Muse more, and that weakens up here. There's still a finite number of allied units. If they're not all bunched up here and they're spread out a little bit more, maybe that is just enough for the Germans to make some encirclements, because the Allies would still have these chits where they can only do movement, they can only do combat, which gives the German player the ability to do more localized encirclements when they can go twice in a row without the Allies being able to do a movement action or something. Two German moves before an Allied move, where you can get some decent encirclements. It is maybe still more feasible. Or maybe what happens is the Germans get through here, and the Allies just say, we're not doing Dunkirk, because it's optional, and they do a layered defense over here. That takes a different element to the game, I think, at that point. So you're almost for sure inviting, if you play with scenario 2, you're almost assuredly going to defend better across the Meuse down here in the Ardennes, which means probably a lot more tension in these plains through Belgium and northern France. So it probably is a very different game at that point. And while I doubt the Germans' chances, I might think that they're worse, it could be much easier. And I guess I'd have to play it to prove it out. But I'm not so sure I'll do that. Now, scenario 3 is a whole nother monster, and I think it's worth talking about scenario 3. Scenario 3 definitely reads as the, let's crack this sucker open. It is, as appropriately titled, the what if scenario, and is with a better commanded French army. There are no movement restrictions or Operation Dynamo, and both sides have additional units. Oof. So this is one that definitely uses a lot of different rules that are satisfactorily changed from the main game. Some of these things are that the Allied units some of them are replaced by counters that have the S3 on them, and they are different versions of those units, in some cases stronger, in some cases weaker or more plentiful. The Germans get some additional units. There's also a few changes to the rail moves. The Allied rail move can be done within 3 hexes of a German unit instead of 5, or being restricted to 5, which means that the Allies have greater flexibility in using their rail movement. The German paradrops are going to happen a little bit differently. Événement has to be rolled for, and it could very well be that the Germans fail to take that fortress with their paratroopers, and so that can drastically change the game. The Allied better defense markers are on a different side, where uh, effectively they get not only the left shift, but they also get an increase in their tactical rating, which suddenly makes it that much harder for the Germans to be able to avoid the Zocs or slip through those Zocs to achieve the things that they need to achieve. And uh, then there's also the impact of the victory points on everything. So you still have Fall case red, that's still a thing. Um, but the victory points are handled very differently. So the victory point, in fact, there's no victory points at all. The way that the Germans win in scenario 3 is they have to achieve 2 of 3 conditions. They have to exit 10 supplied yellow movement allowance units from the west or south map edges no later than the end of action phase of turn 8. So they don't get 10 turns, they get 8 turns to get 10 across the map, which, I mean, I didn't even do that in the game that we played. That's one of the conditions. The second one is to capture all 3 Paris hexes no later than the end of action phase turn 10. So you have 10 turns to take all of Paris down here, sort of off camera, down here. And then the final condition is reduce the Allied forces to fewer than 15 on-map units, either full or reduced strength. And I am curious, did I achieve that in this game? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I actually had 13, so I would have succeeded on that one. Obviously, it's a different scenario that we played, so it's not fair to make that comparison. But that's very interesting. It changes it from a, like, the Netherlands don't have to fall on turn 1. Or turn 2 for that matter, but you obviously want to take care of them quickly so you can keep moving on, right? You don't want enemies in the backfield. It does make it so that you're generally still trying to achieve the same things, right? You want to take Paris, sure. You want to get off the map. You want to eliminate Allied units, but it puts it in a little bit more of a flexible position. How you achieve those things are much more open. But likewise, the setup is very different in that the Allies can set up any way that they want, for the most part. So here, in the way that this would work, is that the French can set up any which way they want. The British are still kind of up here, but they can set up with some flexibility. So you can truly do, set up how you want, totally open. The Germans still set up second, so they can still respond to how you have set up, which means if you've left an obvious weak point, they can attempt to exploit it or whatever. But probably the biggest difference, I think, that would really impact the way the game plays is that you use a different set of action chits for the Allies. So there are some in the bag. I might as well just grab it and show you guys. There are some Allied action chits that are white print here. And the way that they work is they work just like the German ones in that they are or chits. You can do movement or combat, which means instead of the typical game now here being where it's like, okay, I got the combat chit. On the back it says combat, so this is the only option for this guy. We have to do combat even if the combats all suck. And we can only do movement when the movement chit comes up. In scenario 3, the Allies have just as much capability as the Germans to determine what they want to do that will be to the best benefit. And that represents, a better implementation of radios in the command structure to coordinate activities, which I think is an elegant sort of design choice there. So in scenario 3, we are totally off the rails, but it's how the Allies should have prepared for the conflict. And what you're really seeing is probably something more akin to a World War One, Clash of Giants or Glory's End kind of thing from Ted Racer, where the Germans are going to come through here and maybe they're going to get stuck over here. They're going to get stuck around Lille, and there will be totally off the rails scenario, but the game is still requiring the Germans to have achieved a level of victory of either defeating the British army and taking Paris, or creating a breakthrough, some 2 out of 3 combination there. I think it's a very intriguing idea. Now, it almost feels like scenario 3 is even harder than scenario 2 for the Germans, but I think because the victory point stuff doesn't matter as much, that somehow feels to me more open for the German player to operate. And it's really hard. Like, it's such a weird thing. I think not having to worry about the victory point calculation and the fact that the Allies aren't accruing any victory points, it's just about how well the Germans do, makes it feel more straightforward. And I feel like scenario 3 is probably the most game scenario in the box, because both players have as much flexibility as possible to impact the map situation. The one interesting thing is, in scenario 3, there is no Operation Dynamo at all, which really means that everything in that scenario is focused on the slugging match. So it is going to be, rather than conditioned around these great important events like how do we handle Operation Dynamo, how do we operate with the Panzer refit, though the Panzer refit is still an element, it is going to be just a true war game, hex encounter slug match, factors, dice rolls, where do things end up. And I think that makes it much more intriguing and more worthwhile to try to play solitaire, because it just, there's more interactivity, and the Allies can even entertain true counter offensives, which is a very attractive idea. So I think this is going to be it for this video. It's obviously already very long with all of this put together. But I think the more I talk about it, I do think I would like to try to do scenario 3 in that abbreviated video format before I do a review of the game, because scenario 3 as compared to scenario 2 feels like a distinct enough campaign to try, that gives this game a lot more life. It is a wholly different what if scenario, but it's certainly one maybe worth playing, because you get to play with that. Well, the Allies should have done these things. Well, what if they did do some of these things? How does that campaign play out? And I will say, scenario 1 is definitely a worthwhile exercise in understanding the historical campaign as it played out, and navigating some wiggle room in there. This much more scenario 3 would be that much more interesting, a historical what if hypothesis kind of game. So I think that's what I'm going to do. So thanks for watching this video, guys. Appreciate this scenario 1 postmortem. Hopefully, in the days to come, you will see a video titled Scenario 3 Campaign, and I will do those segments again, 1 turn per recorded segment of 5 to 6 minutes, maybe an hour-long video that covers the whole of Scenario 3 in relatively high detail. And once I'm done with that, then we're on the track for the full review video. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope this video was interesting, or at least was entertaining to some degree. We'll see you in the next video. So thanks again. Take care. Keep on gaming.